Hello, class. Welcome to a Teacher's History of the United States. Did you know the colony of Pennsylvania was founded from land given to the Penn family by the king to repay a debt? That the Quakers were actually the first to implement this whole idea of a handshake? That William Penn's son, Thomas Penn, cheated the Native American tribes in the Pennsylvania area out of potentially tens of thousands of acres of land? That the city of Philadelphia actually does mean the city of brotherly love. And that while Pennsylvania maybe wasn't as egalitarian as William Penn had hoped it would be, he left a lasting mark in colonial and American history based off of his ideas when founding the colony. Did you know all that? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because we will learn about that and more in Episode 14, Extra Credit, Penn's Quakers. Hello and welcome to class. To catch everyone up, I'd like to briefly provide context for our discussion today. Last week, I gave a lesson on the Swedes settling in the Delaware River Valley, the Dutch settling in New Netherland, which eventually became New York, and the colonies of Carolina and Georgia. I spoke really briefly about the colony of Pennsylvania, and that is what we will be focused on today. So today we'll be talking about William Penn and the founding of the Pennsylvania colony. And today I'm joined once again by my good friend Zach Woods. Zach, thanks for joining me once again, bud.
My pleasure.
You know, Zach, when you and I were discussing the settlement of the middle colonies, you and I both agreed that by far the most interesting story in all of this is William Penn and the Quakers and the founding of the Pennsylvania colony. But before we begin, Zach, I want to clear one thing up right off the bat, because whenever I taught about Pennsylvania, this is something the students would always ask me. And that is the question of whether or not the character on the Quaker Oats box is William Penn.
Is he?
No, it is not. It actually is not William Penn, although it looks just like him. And if you go to QuakerOats.com, you'll see that they actually address this question on their website. It is not William Penn, but his image is that of, quote, a man dressed in the Quaker garb, chosen because the Quaker faith reflected the values of honesty, purity, integrity, and strength, which is apparently really important in your oatmeal. But anyway, I just wanted to clear that up before we get started.
Yeah, don't get between an honest, hardworking man and his oatmeal.
Yeah, absolutely. So Zach, you know what? Let's just jump right into it. I mentioned how you and I really wanted to talk about Pennsylvania and the Quakers, and we did this because we think they're particularly unique in American history. So Zach, what exactly makes these people so unique?
The Quakers are a religious Protestant denomination similar to the Puritans in the sense that they were separate from the Anglican Church in England. And the Quakers referred to themselves as the Society of Friends. And they had a slightly different Protestant interpretation of a human's relationship with God or the divine. So unlike the Puritans, who was very much important about having a relationship with a minister and a teacher, that's not the case with the Quakers. Anyone can have a relationship with God or divine, and that's why it's called the Society of Friends. Basically, we're all equals. So this causes issues in England. If folks remember from episode 11, our religious freedom episode, we briefly talked about all the issues that were happening in England with the Civil War, the end of Charles I's execution, Oliver Cromwell taking over as the Protectorate, and then Charles II and the restoration of the English monarchy. That's all happening in the lead up to Pennsylvania becoming a colony. So the Quakers, I had mentioned, are somewhat unique, and they're persecuted similar to the Puritans because they don't quite fall in line with the Anglican Church, acknowledging the authority of the king as head of the church. The Quakers, in fact, they won't even take oaths, and oaths are a very important component of the government and society. So they're kind of outsiders, and they've been persecuted. And even in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they're persecuted as well for being, not quite Puritan enough. So what's the best way to end a persecution against you? Have a rich patron who's a member of your religion. And that's kind of what happens with William Penn. William Penn is an aristocrat who has the good fortune of his father passing on a debt that the King of England owed to the Penn family to him. So when Charles II is restored to the English king, he honors the debt to William Penn's father by giving William Penn land in the New World, specifically land along the Delaware River, which will be called Pennsylvania. Penn for William Penn, Sylvania for woods. Basically, Penn's Woods. And that's how we get the colony of Pennsylvania. Now, why was William Penn interested in this? Well, he was a very devout Quaker. He converted to Quakerism, believed in it, wanted to have a refuge for the Quakers who were being persecuted in England. And this was, in part, a solution to this issue in England.
I think it's important to keep in mind, Zach, what you mentioned about William Penn growing up in this wealth and luxury, because for the most part, people of the Quaker faith were not wealthy. They were lower class, and the fact that they had someone who was able to fund their expedition and have someone who could represent them not only socially but politically was very important for them, because it gives their movement a considerable amount of influence and power that they wouldn't otherwise have without William Penn. So let's take a look real briefly at William Penn's life. He attended Christ Church. He dropped out briefly after a couple years because he wouldn't attend the chapel. He was very outspoken, very polemic throughout his childhood and his young adulthood. He was often criticizing the Anglican faith in a variety of ways. And to many Anglicans at the time, Quakers were pretty strange. They believed in an inner light. They embraced democratic idea of a meeting. They rejected social hierarchy, and they actually would not take their hats off when they greeted people, which was a big deal.
And that's a really big deal at the time. That's a big violation of good decorum.
And of course, this comes from the idea that they don't owe deference to anyone but God. Now, as a side note, strangely enough, William Penn actually wore a wig, which also really did not happen in the Quaker faith because they were of lower classes. But William Penn had smallpox as a child and had trouble growing his hair fully, so he had to wear a wig because he was a bit embarrassed. But that's neither here nor there. See what I did there, Zach?
I saw what you did there.
Yeah, that was a pretty good one. I had that one locked and loaded.
I'm glad you had that. But I want to jump in with something else about hats. So this idea of not bowing or curtsying or groveling before people who are your social betters, right? I said that Quakers, they were the society of friends. How do friends greet each other? They greet each other with handshakes. Right, this idea that everyone should greet each other with a handshake as opposed to bowing, curtsying, or groveling, that's a Quaker idea. And that is an idea that, remains with America today.
Yeah, that's a good point, Zach. And going back to Pennsylvania and its founding, what a lot of people don't realize with regards to William Penn and his influence in Pennsylvania is that William Penn was only in Pennsylvania 2 times. And each time he was only there for about 2 years. So he was in Pennsylvania for a total of about 4 years. He was there from 1682, when it was founded, to 1684. And then he left. He went back to England and returned 15 years later in 1699 and stayed until 1701. Now, during that time in between in England, he was still causing trouble. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London for his outspoken criticism of the church. In writing letters to friends, he said famously, quote, "My prison shall be my grave before I budge a jot, for I owe my conscience to no mortal man." End quote. So while he wasn't in Pennsylvania the whole time, he was certainly consistent about his beliefs about the Puritan faith. So, the founding of Pennsylvania. Like you mentioned, Zach, the colony was given to William Penn because of a debt owed to his father. And you mentioned that it was called Penn's Woods, which is where we get Pennsylvania from. And William Penn, believe it or not, did not want it to be called Pennsylvania. Because when you think about it, William Penn is trying to set up a democratic, egalitarian colony, and naming the colony after himself is not the best way to show that example through action, right? He definitely thought that this was hypocritical for himself and his family. Now, when we talk about Pennsylvania, we have to talk about Philadelphia. Philadelphia is...
Can we stop right there? Sure, because you just said Philadelphia. So I think a lot of us know Philadelphia as the city of brotherly love, and it's almost commented on sarcastically or ironically because Philadelphia is known somewhat as a tough town that isn't very welcoming. But the word Philadelphia is in Greek, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. If it literally means brotherly love, and that is another example of Penn's utopian idealism as a Quaker, coming to found this plantation, this colony in the New World, a peaceable kingdom where all would be welcomed. So the very city that is founded about the principle of brotherly love.
Well, Zach, you're correct. Philadelphia does mean brotherly love, although sometimes Philadelphia sports fans don't always emulate that brotherly love, but that's for that chip on their shoulder they act with is, I think, a badge of honor. But let's get back to Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. The colony of Pennsylvania was founded upon ideas of religious freedom, more so than really any colony we've talked about yet. And honestly, it's not even close. And strangely or ironically, this colony was most economically successful right off the bat, even though it was founded primarily for religious reasons. Many people in Philadelphia saw this founding of the Pennsylvania colony as a business opportunity. So they sent over craftsmen, they sent over artisans, a lot of skilled workers were coming to Pennsylvania, and especially Philadelphia. You have a tannery there. So you can see that Philadelphia began to become an economic hub of the American colonies or the North American colonies. And what Philadelphia begins to do is really reflect a city that you would see in England more than any of the other cities that you find in any of the other colonies.
So, again, this is an interesting juxtaposition, right? There's a lot of American mythology or legend around the Massachusetts Bay Colony and their relationship with the natives and their industriousness and success, and not a lot about the Quakers in Pennsylvania. But Pennsylvania very much develops much faster and much more successfully than the Massachusetts Bay Colony, in part because of Penn's idealism and welcomeness and true religious freedom for lots of folks. Because of that, immigration is very open. Pennsylvania is very early known as the, quote, the best poor man's country in the world because they were willing to take Scotch-Irish immigrants as well as German immigrants. As an example, this is where the term Pennsylvania Dutch comes from. The Dutch is not an actual reference to the Netherlands, that type of Dutch. It's rather in reference to Deutsch, which means German, and German, right? Deutschland is Germany. The point being is that it grows very quickly, also in part because Mr. Penn has very fair dealings with the natives. unlike the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where there's initially some acceptance and then very quickly devolves into conflict, William Penn is known for his fair treatment of the Lenape, otherwise known as the Delaware natives who live along the Delaware River, and he pays for land, cuts fair deals, is very much known as, right, Quakers are pacifists, all people are equal, which is a very radical idea for 17th century Europe, and he practices that, and the growth of Pennsylvania, I would argue, is reflected to that egalitarian view.
Zach, you bring up the relationship of Penn and the Delaware Indians, and I agree with you. I think this is a cornerstone to the success of the Pennsylvania colony. And I just want to read you a passage from a letter that Penn wrote to the Delaware Indians in 1681. And now, keep in mind, this is 1681, so this is 74 years after the founding of Jamestown. So William Penn has the blueprint on how to found a successful colony. And he has the benefit of hindsight and the realization that the better you treat the natives, the more successful you likely will become. But let's take a look at this letter he wrote to the Delaware natives. Quote, "There is one great God and power that hath made the world and all the things here in it. This great God hath written his law in our hearts, by which we are taught and commanded to love and help and do good to one another, and not to do harm or mischief to one another. I'm very sensible of the unkindness and injustice that has been too much exercised towards you by the people of these parts of the world. They've sought themselves to make great advantage by you, rather than being examples of justice and goodness unto you, which I hear have been a matter of trouble to you, and caused great grudges and animosities, sometimes to the shedding of blood. But I am not such a man." End quote.
So that letter, Chris, and William Penn in particular, there's very strong resonance in the Native community, in the Delaware community. William Penn is known as a fair dealer. He is known as someone who treats Indians with respect, or the Native peoples with respect. And this legacy is going to become important. It's important also for Quaker legacy, because Quakers throughout American history will actually also be advocates for treating Native peoples fairly and honoring commitments and honoring treaties. For the fate of the Pennsylvania colony, that's going to change, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
And we'll actually get back to the economy in Pennsylvania right after this. Hey class, thanks so much for checking in today and listening to this podcast episode. I really appreciate it. If you could do me a huge favor, if you haven't already, and head over to iTunes and leave a rating and review for the podcast, it would really be a big help. While you're at it, if you want to check out the website that is up and running, www.ateacherofhistory.com, please do. And of course, if you'd like to raise your hand and reach out, feel free to do so on Twitter or Facebook or email, chris@ateacherofhistory.com. All right, let's get back to the discussion. Yeah, and before we get to the economy, I do think it's important to note that while Pennsylvania was more successful than all the other colonies in their goals for establishing an egalitarian society, it was not the utopia that Penn wanted it to be. And this happened almost immediately. The government of Pennsylvania was turning into one motivated by economics, the markets, and trade. And of course, this is not something that William Penn had intended when he founded the colony of Pennsylvania. And he left Pennsylvania lamenting, when he left in 1684, he lamented the fact that he didn't think the colony would end up the way that he had hoped it would. He had very grave worries about the future of the colony. This was the last thing he wanted. And of course, as we know, this is exactly what ended up happening.
Yeah, and that economic trend, so this is actually reflective of what happens throughout U.S. history, which is the access of land, and getting to the access of land is very important, coupled with immigrants from Europe. or from other areas. And what it turns into is this competition. We need more land, because then I can buy this land super cheap as a land speculator. I can then sell it to the newcomers and make a profit. And the people who tend to get in the way are either old treaties with natives or native peoples. And this is something that is reflected consistently with the concept of manifest destiny, moving ever westward. And it happens right from the get-go, pre-founding of the United States with the Pennsylvania colony when William Penn's son, Thomas Penn, takes over.
Well, what's even more surprising about Philadelphia and Pennsylvania taking this turn towards an economic focus is that William Penn was the sole proprietor of the colony. He didn't have to actually hand control of the colony to anyone. In 1676, he had actually secured land from the Duke of York, but because he didn't get total control, there wouldn't be the religious toleration he had hoped, so he waited a few more years until he received the land he hoped along the Delaware River. And looking back on this, William Penn seemingly had been taken advantage of, or was far too optimistic about how he thought the colony would run itself, as opposed to what the reality of the situation ended up being. By the time he headed back to England, he had totally given up power and was afraid that the colony would fall into temptations of financial success. And he was afraid the colony would take on a focus of trade and commerce. In fact, like you mentioned, we have his son Thomas Penn and the walking purchase, which really cements his greatest fears. And Zach, I know you wanted to talk about the walking purchase real quick.
So Thomas Penn is William's son. And we are talking about William as a somewhat virtuous individual, but he did have his flaws. He became incredibly indebted. And his sons, who were given this inheritance of being the sole proprietors of Pennsylvania, Thomas was looking to alleviate some of the debts. And as I mentioned before, gaining access to new land is a great way to alleviate your debts. So Penn and a land agent named James Logan, concoct a scheme to basically get land from the Lenape Indians. Now, the Lenape had solid dealings with William Penn. They were not open to selling more land to Thomas Penn and James Logan, but Thomas was very persistent. And for the record, Thomas wasn't a Quaker. Thomas did not have his father's religious zeal. Well, anyways, so since the Lenape are not willing to deal, James Logan and Thomas Penn concoct a scheme where basically they get a cartographer to alter some records to make it look like that William Penn had agreed and the Lenape chiefs had agreed to sell a tract of land based upon a 3-day walk that had never actually occurred. Now, the Lenape aren't really on board with this, but they decide, okay, we will honor William Penn's memory. We're pretty sure we did this. This was, many years ago, right? The colony's founded in 1682. The date of the walking purchase is 1737. So they agree to it. And the way that this walking purchase these walks would work is you would get up, you would stroll at a very leisurely place, you would stop and smoke some tobacco from the pipe, you'd take a break, go hunt some game. This would be a leisurely stroll through the woods. Well, not as Thomas Penn and James Logan organized it. They basically recruited 3 individuals who trained for essentially a marathon. So for over 3 days, these 3 guys were going to run as fast as they possibly could to get as much distance as possible.
So the idea, Zach, just to clear it up, is that they purchased a specific amount of land from the Native Americans, and that land was determined by how far they could walk in a 3-day period.
And this would be a leisurely walk. Yeah, and it would be basically at the end of it, you would then draw a right angle to the east towards the Delaware River, and that would determine what the land was. So that's not the case. The 3 men that Logan and Penn have hired and are training for this, they basically take off. And the Indians are like, what's going on? You guys aren't right. You aren't doing this right. And the Indians get wise and they get mad. They're like, this is BS. This is not a fair deal. We want nothing to do with it. And they basically desert the walk. But meanwhile, the white guys continue, and only one of them makes it the full distance, goes 65 plus miles out. And at the end of
That's incredible.
In 3 days. Yeah, and at the end of it, instead of drawing a line directly to the Delaware River to the east, he actually draws a right angle to the Delaware River to the north. And basically, they secure with this structure over 1,000 square miles. This is this big controversy. The Delaware natives are very angry. They're arguing against it. And the Delaware Indians actually even asked the Iroquois to intervene. And the Iroquois Confederacy, who they have their own political objectives, and part of their political objectives is to divert Europeans away from what we would now know as upstate New York. They're not going to stand up for the Delaware. So the Delaware are essentially pushed out of the Delaware River area into western Pennsylvania, where there's some Shawnee and other natives and other native refugees from Europeans' incursions are currently living. And this is very important. This event is very important because it spells the doom of good relations with the native peoples in Pennsylvania, which will be very important when we reach the French and Indian War, otherwise known as the 7 Years' War. Because the formerly peaceful existence deteriorates during that conflict into open warfare, which actually gives opening for Thomas Penn's enemies in the Pennsylvania Assembly, namely Benjamin Franklin, to argue against the Penns being the sole proprietors of Pennsylvania and to argue that they should no longer be in charge.
And Zach, I think this walking purchase really represents a changing in attitude and approach to the surrounding Native American tribes, especially with regard to the family that's running Pennsylvania. And of course, this takes place long after William Penn died. He died in 1718, so this is almost 20 years after he died. But like I mentioned, when he died, he was heartbroken because he felt like his holy experiment that he had started in Pennsylvania was, in the end, in his mind, a failure because it had become such a commercial success. But in the end, Pennsylvania was the most ethnically and religiously diverse colony in early American colonization of North America. And the abolitionist movement to get rid of slavery began in Pennsylvania. Ideas of gender equality in the early 19th century really picked up steam in Pennsylvania. So they continued on this tradition of Quaker ideals of egalitarianism and fairness and equality.
Yes, and so building on that, right, the positive legacy of the Quakers and Pennsylvania. So while the Quakers will lose political power in part, and not to get ahead of ourselves in the podcast series, in part because of the 7 Years' War, they still have a very strong legacy. The concepts of freedom of religion that existed at Pennsylvania will go on and inform when the United States is founded. The idea of education for all, right? The Quakers believed that girls and boys should both be educated. This was a big deal at the time. A widened franchise where it was not dependent upon property rights. And this legacy has continued on, whether abolition or equality for women in secular and religious forms. The Quaker legacy in America is very, very strong and very important. And it also translates into the organization of government. Penn's frame of government, he wrote several, is informative to Benjamin Franklin, who will be one of the framers of the Constitution, architects of the Declaration of Independence and the Continental Congress. You can trace, again, some of the Quaker legacy to Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, whose father was a Quaker. So while the Quakers lose political power, and it's this concept of this short-lived utopianism in Pennsylvania is short-lived, they will have a lasting positive impact on North America.
And Zach, now that I think about it, if you go to visit Pennsylvania today and you drive around the frontier of southern and eastern Pennsylvania, you're bound to run into the Amish, the Pennsylvania Dutch, who still speak a dialect of Swiss German, at least many of them do. They're known for simple living. They're known for their plain dress. They either resist or they reject technology, at least as much as they can. And this began with a group of Swiss who came over in 1693 because of the religious freedom that Pennsylvania offered. And look, if you drive through rural Pennsylvania today, there's a very good chance you will drive by an Amish family riding in a horse and buggy. And it's sort of scary that they do this on the shoulder of the road, but there are over 300,000 Amish in the state of Pennsylvania. And some of them still today, and I'm not even joking, still speak German. They have a thick German accent, and some of them even, it's crazy to think about, but know very little English, even though they've lived their whole life in the United States of America. So, to wrap this up, I'd like to make one final note on the founding of Pennsylvania. And 14 episodes into this podcast, we've discussed the founding of Virginia, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Maryland, Delaware, New Netherlands, Carolina, Georgia. But we see that Pennsylvania is really the only colony that's able to maintain any type of success on being founded upon the ideas of true religious freedom and maintaining those ideas over a long period of time. As we spoke about a few weeks ago, these ideas of religious freedom in Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Maryland were much more in word than deed, or at least even a misinterpretation of their word. And like I've mentioned before, this anachronistic thinking gets us to believe that they actually were there for religious freedom, but in fact they weren't. They were there to practice their own religion. Whereas Pennsylvania was different. Although William Penn was disappointed by the development of Pennsylvania, he needs to be credited and applauded for his efforts and for the success that Pennsylvania did find in diversifying ethnicity and its religious beliefs within their population. Well, Zach, thanks so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed this discussion, and once again, I learned something. And hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. Next week, I'll be back with another podcast in which we will be discussing New England society and the Pequot War. I'll see you then.